Good morning, Cedarfield, all those who are here in person, and for those out in the virtual world. This is our first focus group meeting after the pandemic.
Excuse me, you have to turn on your mic.
There we are. Okay, now we're set. All right, I'll start again. Good morning, Cedarfield. For all of you who are in the audience here, and for all those who are out in the virtual world. This is our first meeting since the pandemic, and things are a little different now. This is our first after the pandemic, and so we're sort of learning our way of how to do this. Mary and Bob Hayes have agreed to come up and be our first speakers because they're family, and if it doesn't work, well, it's okay. But I think it's working out very well, especially with Eddie and Georgia being in charge. Today, Bob Hayes will talk to us about some of the log canoes. Bob has had a long career with the federal government, and our daughter Mary is an RN and is now working at a Celtic shop in Smithfield. But they, several years ago, got interested in the log canoes. And as you'll see, it's a fascinating subject. And every day he learns something new about people and all the different boats that are here. I won't bore you anymore with my talk. Let me introduce Bob Hayes. But for those of you, when we have the question and answer time, we will pass the microphone down to those of you here in the audience. But I'm going to have my phone on, and if you will call 922-7283, I will try to, with either text or voice, I'll try to pick up some questions that we can relate to Bob and Mary. Bob?
Thank you, everyone. Can everyone hear me fine?
No.
No. Can you hear? No.
Okay.
This thing's supposed to be good.
Yeah.
How about now? That's good. Sorry, my apologies. Every talk is a little bit different, so please bear with me. It's good to see we got more people here than what I saw in the Ravens game on Sunday. So this is a good thing. So thank you so much for coming, and I'm hoping that everyone will still be interested when this is all over with in what we're doing. Let me throw out a couple of disclaimers if I can. I'm not a professional archaeologist or anthropologist, and I don't play them on television, so you won't. Other than today, I will look like I'll be one. I don't represent or speak for my current employer, the United States Navy or the Department of Defense, and all my opinions are my own. Historical archaeology is an avocation of mine, something that I became interested in several years ago, and I pulled my wife, Mary, in with me as a partner on this project, kicking and screaming. But actually she has been invaluable to me and to this project and what she brings to it. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. Of course, I'm responsible for my own words and opinions here. But I do represent the Mid-Atlantic Logbook Registry, and there are other people that are involved in the project. I talked about Mary's job as the project coordinator, and she's the official photographer for this project. And we do have real archaeologists involved in this project. Dr. John Broadwater is our lead archaeologist, and we also have Mr. Bruce Terrell, who was formerly with NOAA, is retired now, is a historian and also a maritime archaeologist. If you're unaware of who Dr. Broadwater is, Dr. Broadwater was instrumental in bringing up the monitor and for establishing the monitor component of the museum at the Mariners Museum. So we do bring some wealth of knowledge and experience onto this project. And these two gentlemen we've befriended, and they've been kind enough to sponsor us. Our project registry is an ambitious project to catalog all known logboats in Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, and to analyze and classify them based on their evolution and development. And our ultimate goal is to establish a workable, usable database that someday we're hoping we can market, not for monetary purposes, but monitor to institutions and research organizations so they can do a comparative study of logboats. Our only criterion for this project is one thing. The hull of the boat has to be log constructed. That's all there is. So as you can imagine, that opens up the whole world of what is available and what's been discovered. Quick housekeeping. We're part of the Maritime Heritage Chapter of the Archaeological Society of Virginia. The Maritime Heritage Chapter is different from all other chapters of ASV in that we are statewide. Every other chapter is a regional chapter. Ours is not. So anybody who belongs any place in the state that has any interest in maritime archaeology or history is invited to attend. And if that interests you, I have flyers on the back table that you can pick up, and anybody can join and come to the meetings, which are typically, or have been typically, at DHR here in Richmond. And if you're not interested in joining, but you want a bookmark to commemorate you coming today, I have those in the back as well. So please pick those up. And if you're interested in finding out more about our chapter, I've included the website at the bottom. Our partners in the project are the Institute of Nautical Archaeology in Texas A&M. They have been kind enough to give us money, and they have funded our project through grants. And we're also partnered with the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, the Maryland Historical Trust, and also the North Carolina Department of Natural and Cultural Resources. All of those are our partners, and we work very closely with all of them on this project. So before we dig into what our registry does, I want to give you a very brief discussion of logboat development, use, and contributions to maritime history. So if you're going to pass out, now would be the time. So never really know. Let's see where we can start. So we're going to start with a little bit of terminology that I use that I found over time can be confusing, so I wanted to throw this up quickly. A logboat equals a log canoe equals a dugout canoe. A dugout canoe, I'll refer to, and I say that, is typically a single log. If I talk about a multi-log, that's 2 or more log construction. Pre-contact is the same thing as prehistoric. So what does that mean? Prior to European contact, all right? Post-contact equals historic, after European contact. BC is the same thing as BCE, before Christ versus before Common Era. So it's somewhat controversial, but they tried to take the religious component out of AD, BC by calling it BCE and CE. So that might pop up here and there, and if it's confusing, still let me know. And then BP is before present. Now, why do we add BP in there, and why 1950? Quickly, BP was established because January 1, 1950 was the establishment of calibration curves after the start of the atomic era of testing, which changed the carbon-14 concentrations in the atmosphere. And so they had to have a standard date to date everything back from carbon-14. And so 1950 was chosen. So if you see anything that BP, meaning before present, it doesn't mean present being 2020. All right, it means 1950. Sounds confusing, and it can be, but hopefully we're not going to get into any more detail than that. All right, so logboats. One of the first boat types to ever emerge for humankind. Archaeological finds of logboats that have been constructed are worldwide. The oldest that we know of right now is the Pessie canoe in the Netherlands. It's about 8,000 to 7,500 BCE. They believe that's early Mesolithic. In China, we have the Neolithic period dugout canoe that was excavated at this site, and please forgive me, I can't pronounce those words, but I can tell you that this was a site that actually the date of this canoe is actually the site is 7,000 years old, not the canoe itself, but they date it to an earlier establishment or settlement. They have the Nigerian Dufuna canoe, which through radiocarbon dating, they estimate to be about 8,000 years old. And then the Pool log boat, which we're a little bit younger, 295 BCE in the Iron Age, built of oak and an oak trunk. If anybody's familiar with shipbuilding in England, most vessels were built using live oak. And so therefore the oak was the predominant tree species, and that is important when we talk about log boats. As we move forward in time, log boats were typically constructed of whatever tree species were available at the time. Of course, these will give you places to travel once COVID-19 is over. You can go and use these as potential vacation spots. Here in the Americas, the best find that we have is Lake Noonan's in Florida, down near Gainesville. It's about a 12-foot deep lake, about 7,500 acres. During a severe drought period in 2000, there were 101 canoes that were discovered lying at the bottom, all constructed of cypress and pine, and ranged in age between 5,000, going back as far as 5,000 BC to 500 CE. So CE equals AD, so you can see the long period of time, which indicated that Lake Noonan's was really the location or central location of subsistence communities for Native Americans for a long period of time. The Florida dugout canoes, I love this slide. Maritime history by the numbers. It's the largest documented canoe collection in the world from one location. As I said before, 101 vessels found. There are 235 sites where canoes have been found in the entire state of Florida, with 423 currently recorded. That's just single log dugouts. 7,000 years old, that's the oldest one found so far in North America. So what do we know about the Mid-Atlantic? Well, we know from about 1585 when Sir Walter Raleigh commissioned an expedition to sail to the New World, that Thomas Harriot documented that expedition in a publication called A Brief and True Report of the Newfoundland of Virginia. Remember back then everything was Virginia, right? So 1588, and he documented through in writing, as well as John White documenting through his illustrations, that Native Americans would cut down trees, build fires in the middle of these trees, and scrape them out with whatever they could find, shells, deer antler, whatever, and they would create these vessels, these wood canoes. This is probably what they look like, burned out. Okay? So if you're looking at this, you're actually looking at a pre-contact, prehistoric canoe. This is from North Carolina. This is the Autryville canoe. It doesn't go back to BC times, probably 14-something AD. Okay? But this is probably what it looked like. Of course, when John Smith came, Captain John Smith, he arrived, these canoes caught his attention, and he talked about them fishing in them boats, fishing from boats, but they also used them for warring parties. There were canoes documented as long as 60 feet. They would take about 10 to 12 days to construct them, and I love this bottom statement. Instead of oars, they used paddles and sticks, and they could row them faster than we could row our barges. So obviously the Native Americans were adept watermen. Okay? Well, guess what? The English caught on pretty quickly about the value of the dugout canoe, and they started to confiscate many of these Indian canoes. And if they didn't confiscate them, then they could be like John Smith, and where he would capture them on the Nansemond River as he was sailing down, and they would attack him. He would force them out of their boats and then destroy and burn their canoes and take them away. But nevertheless, Europeans then used iron tools and watercraft knowledge and modified them for their own designs and their own purposes. Right now, this is the oldest one that we have in Virginia, but is a good representation of what I just talked about. This is dated somewhere around 1630, was found in the Powder Creek near the Jamestown settlement. And it was a total length of 26 feet, and they believe that this was one confiscated by colonists because it shows iron tool marks, but it also shows burning in the interior. And so they believe that colonists may have taken this for their own purposes, hewed it out to make it even larger to use it. And how common was that? Well, then guess what? In 1619, there was a law that was written that said you couldn't steal canoes from the Indians. And that if you did steal them, and guess what? If you were a freeholder, then you owed that Native American 5 pounds. Okay? If you were a slave or a servant, 40 shillings, and you received a whipping, which you don't see at the bottom. That was written into the law. So it was fairly common to take. Over time, sorry about that. Over time, colonists, as plantations grew along the rivers, what became the cash crop, tobacco, right? And so as you're trying to get tobacco to market and more fertile land got pushed farther inwards, the longer the distance it took to move tobacco to the wharves and to the boats to take them. And so they had two choices. You could either put it in a carriage. These hogsheads, anybody know how much a hogshead of tobacco weighs? Well, it usually would run between 500 and 1,000 pounds, okay? Or they could roll them by horseback, or Reverend Robert Rose in 1740 came up with the idea of lashing 2 log canoes together where he could haul 8 or 9 hogsheads of tobacco and move them downriver for sale. This went away. Does anybody, feel free to speak. Anybody know what replaced the lashed-in canoes? What replaced it? The James River bateau. All right, so around 1800, that's when the bateau comes in, and they're no longer lashing canoes together to try to haul these hogsheads of tobacco down. How common were canoes on plantations, and how common were they being owned? Well, York County inventories show that having more than one was fairly common. 61 individuals owned at least one, 18 people owned 2 or more at a particular time. Actually, there was a master's thesis done by Robert Memory in 1994 from William and Mary that looked at these inventories. Most of the usages were on the back creeks and streams for fishing, transporting families to and from church or social events, as well as for maybe transporting some goods, nothing really large at the time. There also is the current discussion, or has been for several years, about the influence of African slaves on the development of log boats. There is some question about whether certain slaves that were selected from Africa that were known boat builders. Canoe building was very common in Africa, or they were brought here and then asked what skills they had, and then they would say, "Hey, I can build a boat," and then they were selected to build vessels for certain plantations. One of the ones that we have in our registry is what we call the La Trappe Creek canoe, which was found on a plantation. They believe around 1780, 1830, found on one of the Eastern Shore plantations in Maryland. And it was 23 years from when they discovered it to they finally were able to conserve it, and it's at the Frederick Douglass Isaac Myers Maritime Park in Baltimore, Maryland. So if you're ever up there, you want to see this one. But they believe that these African boat builders were also very adept at handling boats, and they were called patroons. They were kept separate from the rest of the slaves on the plantation. Why? Because they knew how to handle a boat, and 2, they knew where all the creeks and where all the escape routes were. So they weren't allowed to associate with most of the individuals on the plantation. Their job was to move family members of the plantation back and forth as well as goods. right, this is what really caused log canoe development and evolution to take off in the mid-Atlantic. And what are we doing here? Oystering, right? And so log canoes, why log canoes? Log canoes were cheap to construct. You didn't need a shipyard. You could drop a tree right where it was. You could build a log canoe, make it as big as you want. Trees were huge then in diameter, so you could construct many of these vessels as one single log or even two log, easily put them together and fish in the shallows and tong for oysters in the shallows. You're thinking, well, what, are planking frame wood not available? Yes, it was, but it was expensive to get. Saw and lumber was hard to get. It was expensive. But also, what did the log also offer? It offered stability, but it also offered great sturdiness, so to speak. It could withstand loads and loads of oysters being piled on the bottom where the thinner sawn lumber couldn't handle it. So these original vessels that were constructed did not have any covers over them. Many were paddled or oared at the beginning, but then they took on what? Sails, right? You moved into the out into the open water to gain more access to the oyster beds. They took on sails around 1840. Watermen up on the eastern shore, in trying to beat each other to market, started building log canoes of multi-log types, adding sails to them, and they started designing these for sleekness so they could do what? Not only beat each other to market, but they established racing associations, which started in the 1840s, reached its height around the 1870s, died off, came back in the 1930s, and has died off again, and now it's back again. So ultimately, though, these are not engine powered, but what kills the log boat really in the 1870s? The implementation of what? Steam, right. Gasoline powered engines come in. Many of these sailing boats were reconfigured to handle engines. They also led to dredging, which was legalized around 1870. And lo and behold, what appears is a dredging bug eye. This is the actual photograph of it in operation. The dredging bug eye, Edna Lockwood. The Edna Lockwood still exists. It's at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum. It's been fully restored, but it's sailed on the Chesapeake Bay for almost 100 years dredging oysters. And it's 9 log. So let's go back a little bit and talk about the sailing laws a little bit more. We talked about the sailing competitions. There are 21 currently that are in the National Historic Register that were original sailing log boats that now are in private possession, but they still are raced today. This one here is the Patricia. Most of these are what we call Tillman construction, and we'll talk quickly about that. But as you can see, the number of bug eyes that resulted, so moved from sailing logs to bigger bug eye boats, which would tend to be 5, 7, 9. They believe somewhere as much as 15 log size construction. This again, we talked to Edna Lockwood. This is a great photograph here of the 9 log Edna Lockwood, the hull being reconstructed. Okay. And then of course, the development of the boats. This is the F.D. Crockett, built in 1924. It is 9 log. If you're not familiar with what a boat is, it's what the name entails. It sails around, goes to all the different boats that are collecting oysters, and it buys them, stacks them up on the decks, puts them in the hold, and then he takes it to market, and he sells them, and he collects the money. So he's the middleman. So this was a boat. This is in our registry as well. And it currently has been restored and is sailing out of Deltaville at the Deltaville Marine Museum. All right, so logboat construction methods. Real quick, unfortunately the slide gets cut off at the top. There were 3 basic area types. There was the Pocosin, the Pocomoke, the Tillman, and then there was this one that we're going to talk quickly about here in the next slide, the split log cooner. The Pocosin, was in Seaford, Dare, Virginia. What you gotta remember here is that these boats were all log constructed. They called them rising sides, which were still logs. They chunked them, so Pocosin boats were often called chunk boats, and they were built by rack of eye. Does anybody know what that means? Rack of eye means you laid it out, and if it looked right, you started carving it, and something, oftentimes one side wasn't the same as the other, or it was off on down the midline. Experience made you better at it. The Pocomoke and the Tillman were both Maryland inventions. The Maryland both relied on building half models. The Pocomoke on the lower end of the bay, Tillman on the upper end of the bay, which became the most popular. And their real difference was in the type of planking, carvel versus lap straight. Lap straight, one plank over the other. Carvel, they fitted nice together, and then they had to chain them. Great representation of this one's a Pocosin boat, how they would carve them down, and then they would attach them with iron pins on the sides and the rosin wood. This is a Pocosin, what it would look like once they've attached all the logs. The split logs were cooners, it was a colloquial name, or local name, and what they did here is they took one log, split it down the middle, and then they added a keel, and then they reattached all three. So what design is this? French Huguenot. So the French Huguenot settled in South Carolina, and they believed that the Cooner in North Carolina became the workboat of the time of the 1800s for North Carolina, and it gave rise to what we call the periauger. There are 5 or 6 of these split logs that are in our registry. It exists. There are no periaugers. Periauger difference is that the Cooners were rowed, periaugers were 2-masted. Okay, there is one periauger that is a reproduction that was built several years ago that is available or can be seen at the Beaufort Museum. All right, and then I throw this one down here, the 5-log Dismal Swamp one that was discovered by the maritime archaeologists in North Carolina. This is in the Dismal Swamp, and I bring this one up here because they believe that the actual Cooner may have had some impact on the development of the Pocosin boat, because this is not a Cooner, and this is in Pasquotank County, and this is a 5-log Pocosin boat. So obviously they were not isolated, and so there is some interest in, hey, maybe there was some interaction of the different boat builders involved in the design of these log boats. Some split logs that are available. The Bonnerton boat, looks like you can still row it, right? Around 1870, but boy, I would not get in the Weber canoe out of the Pamlico River, and it's in the outdoor shed down at Curry Beach. And so this is all that's left of it. All right, so we talked a little bit about that, so let's talk about our registry. All right, the state databases are a big contributor to our registry, and each state has their own database of log constructed boats. And Mary and I have spent an inordinate amount of time in each archive from each state going through that and cataloging that information into our registry. So it is part of it. We also cast our net wide for anything else that we can get. The best source, the best one I love is this one here. At a talk year before last, after I finished my talk, a woman came up to me and handed me this napkin with all of this information and said, I know where there are log canoes, and gave me this list. Okay, and so we went down the list, and sure enough, there are log canoes at all of those locations. So anything, any place we realize, any talk, you never know what we're going to run into. So what's in our registry? Right now we have 181 log boats registered in our registry. Pine and cypress are the dominant wood types. Okay. 109 are single log dugouts, 52 are pre-contact, 72 are multi-log. And laboratory confirmation of the aging of these boats is sporadic. We'll talk about that here in a little bit. And then with that, our initial registry is 140 data fields in an Excel spreadsheet for each state, and every boat goes into that Excel spreadsheet. And our next phase, phase 2, is trying to decide on what type of database program we're going to use to log it all in. Whoops. All right, so dating techniques. Carbon-14 analysis, radiocarbon dating has been used. We found that in the record. We have not found any dendrochronology that is used. So if anybody knows what dendrochronology is, it's the counting of tree rings, but really the purpose of dendrochronology is each ring contains a finite amount of carbon-14, which can be used to help establish a baseline for the carbon-14 analysis. Why don't we do carbon-14 analysis? Because one sample costs you $1,000 to get it done. All right? So unless we suspect that they're pre-contact boats, radiocarbon dating really doesn't cut it. So what do we use to make these determinations of pre-contact versus post-contact? Well, what do we remember the first slide where we talked about they being burned out? That's the sign, right? Heavy charcoal, no tool marks, no other features to it tell us that, hey, this is probably a candidate for carbon-14 analysis and it's probably a pre-contact boat. But if we run into such things as iron pins, hack marks, look like adze marks, nails, gauge pins were drilled from the outside and they knocked a pin in, and so then they would use that to determine how much they had to carve the inside out. That is a European technique for carving out a boat. Or this one, what is that? That's a hole drilled through the bottom so they can put a shaft of a propeller or a motor through the bottom of the canoe. That is not Native American. All right. So mast steps for sailing. Okay. With no indication that sails were ever made or created by Native Americans. All right. So all of these tell us then that this is a post-contact vessel. So let's look at North Carolina. What do we find in North Carolina? North Carolina is our largest contributor to our registry. 85 log boats that we've recorded from 21 counties. This is the most important piece of information. 78 single log dugouts, 52 are pre-contact. The only state where we have pre-contact, or if you want to call it that, prehistoric log boats, is in North Carolina, so far. Okay, least number of multi-logs, 7, and they're all split log canoes. 47 log boats associated with 6 Poquoson or Carolina Bay lakes. So the single largest find is one location in Lake Phelps, and carbon-14 dating for 30 canoes. We get ages ranging from far back as 2400 BC to AD 1810. Okay, quick slide to show you that we have the 52 pre-contacts in 11 counties here, and single post-contact 26 found in 13 counties. So obviously there's overlap between the two. The Carolina Bay and Poquoson lakes, we had 6 lakes, and look how many canoes we've got out of them, 47. Okay, so what does that tell us? These were areas of subsistence communities, correct? Biggest find, Lake Phelps, 16,000 acre lake. It's the second largest find in the southeast. What was the first? The first slide that we looked at, right? Lake Noonan, right? Okay, a drought, fire, they pumped it down because they were trying to fight a peat fire, and lo and behold, they found 30 canoes. 25 have been measured and studied. Made of bald cypress, they were burned and scraped. The longest is 33 feet. 19 have been radiocarbon dated, 2400 BC to AD 1400, abandoned over a period of 3,000 years. There have been massive studies done around Lake Phelps, a lot of, I think several masters and theses, PhD dissertations done on Lake Phelps to demonstrate that artifacts go back as far as 9,000 BC of Algonquin settlements along the lake. Pottery, certain types of tools, utensils, so forth, have been located. All right. Virginia, 46 total log boats identified, 40 log boats from 22 counties. We have 6 log boats that we don't know where they are, okay? We got them in the registry, there's documentation, but we don't know where they are. 25 are single log dugouts, but all are post-contact. The oldest was the 1631 that I showed before. In Maryland, 50 total log boats, 47 located in 10 counties, 3 log boats, no clue. All right. all are post-contact. The thing to remember here is this: multi-logs dominate the registry. Why? Because we have 21 of those sailing log canoes, and to date there are probably more than 60 or 70 that still have to go into the registry that are not on the National Historic Register that have that work constructed. Okay, so we said Lake Phelps, and we got all these lakes, 47 canoes. Why no lakes in Virginia? Why haven't we found anything in Virginia or in Maryland? Well, Maryland's out. There aren't any natural lakes in Maryland. Not anymore. I think there's a mud hole somewhere up in western Maryland. Okay, and there used to be Pocosin style or type lakes in Maryland, but they're called Maryland basins, and they're now part of the major river systems that have gone away. So nothing's been found there. Virginia has 2, all right? Warren's favorite spot, Mountain Lake, in the western part of the state. We know there are no canoes there because it drained itself several years ago, and the only thing found there was an empty car and the skeletal remains of an individual that fell out of a boat in the 1920s, all right? So that's all that's there. Then we have Lake Drummond and the Dismal Swamp. Okay, we know Native American populations existed as far back as 13,000 years ago. And we also know that it was also after European contact and slaves were brought here, that there were a group of runaway slaves that were called Maroons that lived in the Dismal Swamp. To date, we haven't found anything related to that, but we're not scratching it off the list. In fact, I'm working with a professor at Christopher Newport University and another friend of mine, and we have this wild idea of going out and doing side scan sonar of Lake Drummond at some point to see what we can find in the bottom. Very shallow. Drummond drains itself down. It is a sandy bottom, and so we're being basically told that we're full of it, but we think it's worth a try anyway. All right. If you're interested in the Maroons, there is a big study done out of American University, and I can't remember the professor's name, Dan Sayers. Dan Sayers has spent his entire lifetime doing studies on the Maroons. Has only found, and all he's ever come away with is a cigar box worth of finds. So, oh, and I want to go back and talk about mill pond. Why did I throw mill ponds in there? Because this past week, Mary and I realized that there were 2 mill ponds in Caroline County that both have, because when dams broke, boats were found there. They're all post-contact. But one of the boats actually is one that they couldn't find any information on at the Jamestown Festival Park on the one that they had under glass on display. And we think we found it. Documented from the 1964. Okay? And we think it's the one out of Caroline County. So mill ponds, possibly. Okay, which are obviously dammed up creeks or streams and rivers. So that's a possibility for us. Okay, so logboat picks and current project work, why you really came today. Okay, so right here in Richmond, where we got 2 great displays. We got the Valentine Museum. Have you seen the Valentine one before? Yeah, the Valentine Museum out of Richmond. Both of these are post-contact vessels. The Valentine Museum was discovered by G.G. Kirby in 1930 in the Mattaponi River in King and Queen County, and he was looking for somebody to take it. Actually, I think he was looking for somebody to buy it. And Granville Valentine went and snatched this boat and brought it because he was starting the Valentine Museum, and he wanted a centerpiece for the museum, and here it is. And so it's been conserved twice. Granville dumped turpentine all over it, and then put in a mixture of paraffin and something else, kerosene I think it was, and then basically conserved it that way. And then over time it started to fall apart. So in about 2012, 2013, the museum had it reconserved. Okay. So it's still the centerpiece of the Valentine Museum. And so why do we make a big deal about the Valentine? Because it's the centerpiece of many publications. You'll find it in a ton of work that's out there. In fact, VCU just recently did a 3-dimensional scan. Their archaeology group just did a 3D scan that Mary and I were kind of involved with, at least helping to get it set up. So, and then the next one, and I apologize for the poor quality of the photograph. This is the one at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in Richmond. This was one recovered in 1995 by a gentleman named, I think it's Ken Busby. Ken Busby had a place on the Potoc Creek in Dahlgren, Virginia, King George County, and over a 40-year time period, he watched this vessel reveal itself in the bank, and then after a major storm event, it broke loose and floated down the river. He grabbed it. He's from near my hometown, which is Lapeta, Maryland, so he packed it up and took it back to Maryland. Maryland didn't want it. They ended up bringing it back to Virginia, and ultimately the museum wanted it as a centerpiece for the museum, so they took it and conserved it. It is a post-contact boat. What I think is the most interesting is that we talk about all the boats from North Carolina, Maryland, even the multi-logs are all built of pine or bald cypress. What makes this one so unique is this chestnut. Where do you find chestnut? The Appalachian Mountains, right? So how in the world is this a chestnut? Well, if you look at the flora of Virginia, you'll find that there were pockets of chestnut that existed on the coastal plain. And the blight didn't come in until the 1940s. So in King George County, there was a pocket of chestnut that existed. Is this from that pocket? Possibly. But I think this is the most interesting to me, is the fact that it's chestnut. All right, some other ones that we're working on. Okay, the Bradby canoe. These are the Indian canoes that we've come across so far. The Bradby canoe was built in 1895 by Terrell Bradby at Pamunkey Indian on the Pamunkey Indian Reservation as a gift to Leicester Manor, and it ultimately ends up in the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian then gets rid of it, and nobody knows where it is, and lo and behold, we find it at the Calvert Marine Museum. Okay? In fact, I'll be up at Calvert Marine Museum, both of us will next week, to lay eyes on this for the first time. But yes, they have it. They've had it for quite a while. He built it in 1892. It had 4 paddles, but the Smithsonian claims the paddles have been missing since 1899. So if anybody knows where those paddles are, please let us know. All right. The other one is the two at the Mattaponi Indian Reservation. This one was built by O.T. Costello, who was chief of the Mattaponi tribe in 1940, and it no longer exists. It rotted away. This one, the museum claims, was found in the Mattaponi River. It's currently on display within the museum itself, and rumor has it that it's 200 years old and that the Smithsonian came and looked at it, but we cannot find any records in the Smithsonian or the state of Virginia. So this is one that we're currently working on, trying to do some investigative work to find out more information. We have a couple that are on private property, owned by private citizens. Yes, we work with private citizens if they find them. I bring up these two because these two private citizens that have these two vessels will not deal with us. Okay? So all we have is photographs, but they won't allow us on their property to see them. All right? This one we know, we know this one has been moved. So this one now sits in Quincy Freeman, who's the owner, sits in his wife's flower bed in the front of his house, we know that, in a tank of water, all right? That's all we know. And so I have a couple of people who have even live in the same county that have tried to contact him on our behalf, and no luck. So we're not giving up though, all right? This one was these two were found in Surrey County. They were wanted and they're still missing. All right, these are the Andrews and Menton Bell. There were 4 canoes that they found in the James River, and we don't know where they are. So this is all we got. Okay. This was the John Wells canoe in Isle of Wight County. It was missing for a long time, but by God, we found it. And you know where we found it? We got thirsty one evening and decided to walk down the street and lo and behold, there she is, right there, hanging on the wall at the Wharf Hill Brewery in Smithfield, Virginia. Okay? So that's the photo. So we found it. This one, we have no clue whatever happened to this one. This article showed up in the Richmond Times-Dispatch in 1983. James Watson, who was a backhoe operator, dug this thing up, okay? And we don't know whatever happened to it. So we have two, the Nominee Creek and the Meacham Creek boats. The Meacham Creek boat is a multi-log boat that still sits in the bottom of the river. It was surveyed in 1982. We don't know if it's still there. But this one, we're really interested in. And this was a single log dugout that was left in the mud in Nominee Creek. If you know, Nominee Hall was a big plantation, and it was left there. And Brendan Burke, who is hopefully one day will be our new maritime archaeologist for the state of Virginia, he and I are in discussions about getting our kayaks out one day and going down the Nominee Creek. We do have some GPS coordinates on it, and we're hoping to go out there and see if we can find it. So there is hope for that. We have several others that were barn and pond storage that we're trying to track down. This one was interesting. The Charles City County Chickahominy canoe was found in Chickahominy, in a back creek of the Chickahominy River by a local farmer named Charlie Tench, and it was sunk in a pond in 2013. And guess what? 3 weeks ago, we went out and met Charlie Tench, and there she is. We pulled it out. He and his boys pulled it out, and we were able finally to survey this boat 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, and we even found a home for it. The Jamestown Yorktown Foundation is going to take it. We know it's a post-contact. It's got a lot of unique features, from nails to netting, which we believe are fish nets stuffed inside of it. There's a lot of interesting features on this boat. The Accomack County boat, this has been a real thorn in our side because it shows itself and then it doesn't show itself, and then only a couple of folks have been out to see it. Mike Clem from the state of Virginia is the only one really to go see it when it's revealed. There are some permitting issues involved. It's on private property, and that also adjoins with the Nature Conservancy, so there are several organizations involved. We had a team ready to go out last fall to dig it up, at least to try to get a better look at it. I think it's a Pocomo type vessel, but we were stopped dead in our tracks, and I got in a lot of trouble because of lack of a permit. So I've kind of backed off of it, but I'm back on the hunt again to try to get back to this one. This one's a match, thanks to Mary. This was a photograph that was dug up in the Virginia files, and we could never get anybody to tell us what this vessel was or where it is. Right here, it was loaded on a trailer. Whatever happened to it, no one had any records of it. Lo and behold, our daughter goes to the Steamboat Era Museum while visiting her boyfriend in Irvington one day, and shoots this and says, "Hey, I found the logboat, here it is. What do you think of this one?" And Mary looks at it and goes, "There's our Matthews County boat right there. That's it." Rotting on display at the Steamboat Era Museum in Irvington. So we got at least two pictures. We got original find. Where is it today? All right, so this is a photograph of one of the Lake Phelps boats, the longest one that was pulled out, 33 feet. The state of North Carolina has graciously given us permission to use this for all of our talks, so we appreciate that. This is the largest vessel in our registry, 38 feet, and it's only 75% intact. It's at the Onslow County Museum in Onslow, North Carolina. It weighs about 2,000 pounds. It took 20 Marines to move it into the museum, and we believe one side is missing, that there actually was another side. That's why it sits in this cradle, that there was another side to it. Why would we use a boat that big? Warring party? No. It is pre-contact. North Carolina, we have the Brinkley deck log canoe, or gunning canoes. These were pretty common in the marshes of North Carolina, where they would construct log canoes and they would hunt from them. Okay. This is pre-contact from Lake Waccamaw, Columbus County, North Carolina. This one's currently being conserved by the state of North Carolina. The biggest issue with recovering this vessel, as well as several others that still exist in Lake Waccamaw, is it has a high density of alligators in this lake. So trying to recover underwater artifacts is a little bit difficult, all right? And this gentleman, which, believe it or not, is not me, that's Nathan Henry with the state of North Carolina, told me, yes, you have to almost mark the alligators before you dive. So you know where they are, and you have to watch them because they move towards you as you're moving towards the dock. Why? Because people throw food off the dock. So, in the beginning, all of America was Virginia. I love this end of this slide. Any questions? Hopefully, oh, one more thing before any questions are, if you're interested in anything related to any of this topic, there are 3 great books. There's Tradition, Speed, and Grace, the Chesapeake Bay Sailing Log Canoes by John North. John North is in his 90s. He wrote this book, and he sailed these canoes since he was 18 years old. And he wrote a wonderful book on this. This is available at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum. Another great book on buy boats that also deals with log boats was Larry Chowning's book on buy boats, Chesapeake Bay buy boats. Fantastic book. And then, of course, the father of all log boats and the authority on all boats Chesapeake was M.B. Brewington, and the Chesapeake Bay Log Canoes and Bug-Eyes. A great read. It's actually condensed from a 2-volume he wrote for the Mariners Museum back in 1937. If you're interested in any of that, let Warren know, and I can give you the suggested readings or locations on that. If there's anything else, any questions that you don't get to answer today, please let Warren know. I'd be more than happy to, he can forward those questions, and I'd be more than happy to answer them for you at some point via email. So I only give the talk, my wife answers all the questions. So I'm interested in anything that you've got to add or any questions that you might have. I'll make my best attempt at answering.
Anybody?
Yes,
John?
sir.
Percentage breakdown between white manufacturing and what percentage of manufacturing use of these boats would be the white population and the Native American population?
That's a great question. In North Carolina, well, we have 52. If you're asking what we currently have, 52 out of 109 so that would be what, about slightly less than half were Native American. But if the question becomes, Mary and I were having this discussion coming up the road, and in no means is this to disparage anybody or any group, but M.B. Brewington, even though he's considered the prime authority or the premier authority on Chesapeake boats, goes out of his way in his publications to make an indication that only white people had the ability, Europeans had the ability to construct log boats, and that African influence was 0. Okay, well, he didn't say 0, but it was only after they were told what to do, but that is not necessarily the case. This is a current argument that I have found, is that there are several archaeologists out there that say you can't do a typology of boats. You can't say this one is, unless it's got char marks and no tool marks. And you don't know who, if you don't know who built it, you can't say this was Native American and this is Caucasian built or this is African built. There is a group of people that believe that, and that because the typologies and the tools used are different depending on location. I'm probably going off the track here a little bit, but one of the things that I have found is interesting is that depending on the region where we're finding boats, here in Virginia, Caroline County, King George, those boats tend to look different than ones that we found and find in other locations. They tend to be more squared off, more pointed. Why? Was that a local technique? Who built it? Was that African influenced, or was it just something that was fairly common based on? You look at the Valentine; all of them look like the Valentine Museum boat, or pretty close to it. But if you move away from that area and you look at other locations, they tend not to look like that. They tend to be more flatter and spread out. So I don't know if I've answered your question, probably not. But But I'd say, other than trying to determine whether they're pre-contact, i.e. that would be Native American, versus post-contact, that's about as far as we can go. To say, though, that we had Indians that were not, like Terrell Bradby, in his construction of his boat from 1892, in the citation, when he wrote the citation, or as it was dictated and written down, he said, I constructed this vessel using Indian techniques with white man's tools. So.
Any other questions? I have no questions from Walden as now.
Yes, sir.
Roger.
The boat that you most recently uncovered,
Yes.
say a little bit more about that. Did the family just find it in that pond? Did they contact you? Did you already know about it? Just tell a little bit more about
Sure.
that story.
You want to pull up some pictures? Or no? No, okay. We call it the Chickahominy Tench canoe, all right? So what happened is that this guy named Charlie Tench, who's a farmer over in Charles City County, his property has been in his family for 7 generations, I think, is what he tells me. Was back hunting in 2012. He likes to go in this back creek that he claims is on his property. And he was duck hunting. And he walked us back to the location where the vessel was found. I'm thinking real quick. See if I can give you a better representation of it. Come on, baby. Shoot. Okay, that's it. Okay, so in the upper screen here, he found it back in here. He walked us back to where it was. Okay. So he pulls it out, and he's doesn't know what to do with it, and he has a flooded area on his farm, and he puts the boat in the flooded area. He collects it, puts it in the. So he goes to church, and he meets this guy who is a doctoral student at William and Mary, who goes to the same church, and he makes some comment to him about it. And so they decide to move it. And Charlie Tench's cousin, Susan Bauer, who was also a Dr. Susan Bauer from William and Mary, owns this pond. And so they brought it over and they sunk the canoe in the pond. And this individual who was the doctoral student then contacts the state of Virginia. And Dr. Broadwater, who was our sponsor at the time, he and a couple of other folks go out there and they survey the thing about early 2013. They promised Charlie Tench that they're going to come back for it. So he resinks it. That's 2013. I'm sitting in my office one day trying to find a phone number actually for a retired state archaeologist to talk about another boat. And by chance, I think that I found the phone number and I dial it, but instead of dialing that guy's number, I dialed Charlie Tench's number. And I asked, and he says, well, sorry, there's so-and-so's, he doesn't live here. He goes, my name is Charlie Tench. And I go, oh, Charlie Tench, I have a question for you. And so I tell him who I am. I won't repeat what Charlie Tench said to me over the phone, but he didn't call me very nice things, because he thought I was one of the guys that came out and looked at the boat back in 2013. And he says, you promised me you were going to come back and get it, and you never came back to get it. And I said, that wasn't me. But I'd love to come and see the boat. Well, I'm going to give it to Bass Pro Shops. Okay, well, let's not do that, okay? Can we at least look at it and see? What if I find a home for it, would you be? So, never, to make a long story short, through Dr. Broadwater, I was able to hook up with Luke Porcaro with the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, and I convinced Luke to come with me to look at it. So Mary and I and Luke and another guy came out and looked at it, called Charlie. Luke's like, yeah, we want it, we want it, we want it. And what we did was we found great things about this boat that no one had ever documented. It's got a whole series of nails that the nails themselves may tell us the time period, because the nails are blunted over. It has the shadow markings of ribs on the inside. It also has netting and some sort of fabric plugging that was stuffed into the back. And it also has, which we don't see in this photograph, it has a hole drilled in through the bottom of it, through the back of it, just like that other one that I showed you that could have had a propeller shaft. So was it constructed and then modified later? We don't know. But there's a lot. I've had Bruce Terrell, our historian's looked at it, wrote a great report about what he thought it was or what it could be. We did the same thing. We think it's post-contact, but I think it's got a lot of story to tell. It's very shallow. It's only about a foot deep. And it's only 13 feet long.
What
No,
last-
it
what
has,
last-
I'm
what
sorry.
last- Go ahead.
It has some dark coloration on one end that I questioned, but in the reality, no, it was not.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Good. Short question, short answer.
This is how you reduce the number of questions. You get long answers.
What year was it that you all actually got to see it and found it?
This one that we just talked about 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
Yeah, it's our,
Last
yeah.
What techniques are you using to preserve the boats after you come out of the water?
Did I tell you this question was going to come?
That's a long answer.
I have no technique. Okay. Actually, I don't conserve them, but we're trying to find homes for certain of these. And I'm thinking that's the problem with the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation's issue right now is they're going to take the boat, but they have to find how they're going to conserve it, where they're going to put it. And there are several techniques that you can do with waterlogged vessels. The state of North Carolina is currently using a product called SP11, which is something better than polyethylene glycol, which is like the Busby canoe was initially conserved in PEG. Very expensive. Well, both of them, SP11 is what, $1,000 for 20 gallons or something. So if you've got a tank of a 16-foot boat, it's cost you money. And then you've got to decontaminate the boat. So what does that mean? You've got to get rid of the fungus and the bacteria, and so you got to treat it with boric acid or something, and then you got to replace it. There was a technique, that was North Carolina used on their Lake Phelps boats that ended up not working, and what they did is they conserved them in sucrose. And what happened is over time, sucrose precipitated out, and you had this white film over these boats, and it smelled just like a house of pancakes. All right, so they've taken all those boats back. They are 4 currently at ECU, at the Queen Anne's Revenge Lab, actually, where they are reconserving those, trying to force all the sucrose out of them and trying to reconserve. So there are several techniques. The big home for conservation is if you can't send it to the Mariners Museum, which really isn't taking anything, then the big one, like if you've read about the Alexandria boats that were found, those are all getting recorded and shipped to Texas A&M. That's the big lab.
But since the boats have been in the water for 4,000 years, you can just leave them in the water.
They got to stay in the water, but they do. And so we looked at the one here, the Matthews County one. What happens when you pull it out of water? You see what it happens to it,
Yeah.
right? So
Listen, this is great. Okay.
we try to satisfy all customers here.
It occurred to me that one thing that we never did on the individual log canoes, why not an outrigger? Our friends in the Pacific figured that out, but was that primarily because they went out into the ocean or was calmer waters? I wondered why they didn't get some stability by putting that on there.
That's a great question. That's a really great question. None of these that we know of were ever taken out beyond the actual rivers or the Chesapeake Bay. And for the Mid-Atlantic, they were using these primarily for oystering. So of course you got to oyster from both sides of the boat. You can't oyster from one side. And so you add in the mast, and then also the boat's built up on the sides because when you go out in rougher water, you've got a boat that's only 14 inches drag. What? You got to build up the sides or you're going to get swamped. And then you put a bunch of oysters in the bottom, it's weighing it down. So then they started adding sides to the boat, and then they realized, hey, we need larger boats. And guess what? We don't have logs as big enough anymore because we've depleted that supply of logs. Look, in the 1800s, the mid-1800s, it's documented there were over 7,000 log canoes sailing on the Chesapeake Bay. Okay? And so that's how prevalent they were and how the depletion of wood supplies were. And so what? You don't have large logs, so what do? 2 makes 1, right? 3 makes 2, or whatever, okay? So you're building bigger boats, larger size. So the outriggers were used for stability, but in here they were used, these log boats were used for commerce, transportation primarily. Even though the Native Americans used them for warring parties, they still, I haven't seen anything that says that they used, or is there documentation that Native Americans used it or had an outrigger to do that, to move large warring parties. Who knows? I don't know what, I guess I have to go back and look and see what Powhatan actually did when he sent them across the bay to the eastern shore to bring the Accomax into compliance.
Well, Bob, listen, great talk.
Thank you.
I think for your enthusiasm. You're really doing a great job. But we thank you for this and for all who participated, both here in person and virtual. And I think, Mr. Dunn, I think it's been a successful go with this, and I think for the future of David and the rest of them. But thank you all for coming, and I'm sure Bob will be happy to answer any questions for you.
Yes, if you've got anything.
Thank you,
just
Eddie.
call Warren.
Eddie Lau.